Thank you. So I think I'd like to introduce our pedagogy panel. Our moderator is Abby Spinak. She's a lecturer in urban planning and design here at Harvard, where she teaches environmental planning and environmental history. She received her PhD in urban studies and planning at MIT and has held fellowships at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard and the Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences at Rice University. She's currently writing a book about electricity and economic citizenship in the early 20th century United States. So today we have 5 panelists for the pedagogy panel. Eng Lee is an architect and assistant professor at the School of Architecture at Northeastern University. She's participated in exhibitions at the Echo Art Fair in Buffalo, New York, the 2013 Lisbon Architecture Triennale, and Storefront for Art and Architecture. Her writing and work has been published in Log, Clog, Thresholds, Manifest, Abater, Wired, and Blueprint. Andrea J. Merritt is a PhD candidate in architecture at Columbia University, writing her dissertation on the history of feminism in American architecture. Her research has received support through a Buell Center Oral History Prize, a Schlesinger Library Oral History Grant, and the Milka Bliznikov Prize from the International Archive of Women in Architecture. She is co-curator, along with Sarah Rafson, Lori Brown, and Roberta Washington, of Architects Traveling Exhibition, Now What? Advocacy, Activism, and Allies in American Architecture since 1968. Sai Balakrishnan is an assistant professor of urban planning at the GSD. She has worked as an urban planner in the United States, India, and the United Arab Emirates, and as a consultant to the UN Habitat in Nairobi, Kenya. Through her research and teaching, Balakrishnan focuses on institutions for governing rapid urbanization and on the spatial politics of land use and property. Her work has been published in Pacific Affairs, Economic and Political Weekly, and in edited book chapters. Her book, titled Shareholder Cities, Agrarian to Urban Land Transformations Along Economic Corridors in Liberalizing India, is forthcoming from the University of Pennsylvania Press. Hansi Beder-Baratza's research focuses on the intersection of design methods, social practices, and equity. In 2002, Baratza co-founded Studio Lutz Architects based in Boston, and in 2010, she co-founded BRACE, Building Research plus Architecture plus Community Exchange, a nonprofit dedicated to creating new spaces through community partnerships. Baratza earned her BArch from Cornell University and Master's in Architecture and Urban Design from the Harvard GSD. She joined RISD's faculty in 2002 and served as a graduate program director from 2014 to 2017. Sonia Dumpelman is a landscape historian and associate professor of landscape architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Her work focuses on urban landscape history in the Western world and the intersections of landscape, science, and technology. Her publications include Seeing Trees, A History of Street Trees in New York City and Berlin, Flights of Imagination, Aviation, Landscape, Design, a book on the Italian landscape architect Maria Teresa Parpiaglio, thank you, Shepherd, the edited Cultural History of Gardens and the Age of Empire, and the co-edited Women, Modernity, and Landscape Architecture and Greening the City, Urban Landscapes in the 20th Century. So like in the previous panel, we'd like to prioritize questions from women of color first. And if you could, when you ask a question, wait for the mic runner to bring you the microphone because the event is being recorded and we'd like to be able to hear your question. So now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Abby. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. And welcome back from lunch. Let me start by saying thank you so much to the conference organizers for putting together this wonderful event and also for being very organized about it, which made it a pleasure to work with you through it. And I'll start by just to say a quick note on the power of collaboration in mundane ways. The 6 of us have been engaging in in conversation in a shared Google Doc for the past week on the questions that we're about to talk about, just to organize our thoughts on this panel. And this ended up being a really enjoyable and productive experiment in question generation, in collaborative question generation. And so I wanted to thank all of you for being part of that. And for providing also a methodology to think with, because I think that that could be a powerful tool for other kinds of research endeavors. So the first question the organizers asked us to consider was about the relationship between pedagogy and identity. And so what I'm going to do is to ask you to start by talking about the importance of teaching the biographies of the people whose designs and ideas we highlight within our programs as essential to understanding our fields, and to talk about how we should do that in an engaged and responsible way. So as I was putting this together, I engaged in the cheap trick of looking up the word pedagogy in the dictionary. And the definition of it was the method and practice of teaching. And I think this is important because it asks us to question here not just the ideas that we're teaching, but also how we're socializing our students, what kinds of examples we are providing, and how that's a constant struggle. Especially, I know a couple of you brought up the deep structural flaws of studio, and that's not an area that I have personal experience in, but I've heard a lot about that, about studio as a particular structural space. And I hope that you'll bring that up throughout the conversation. I was looking at what's left of the SAM list online this week, and one of the articles they link to is called "So You've Sexually Harassed or Abused Someone, What Now?" And in this article, the author offers a list of key points that I thought might be useful for us. I guess I'm revising it to be, so half the people on your syllabus have harassed or abused someone or been complicit in a culture of that. What now? And so I'm just, as a provocation, going to go through the 7 points that she recommends. So number 1, stop calling your victim a liar. Number 2, don't wait to be accused. Number 3, pause before immediately saying what a better person you are now. 4, understand exactly what you did. 5, face the consequences. 6, use your power for good. And 7, do not expect forgiveness. So I'm just offering that as a provocation for, could we apply that to the people we teach? Could we teach in that light where we don't, where we position them within their consequences, don't excuse their work for speaking for itself outside of their subjectivity, and don't forgive them for the way that they lived apart from their design and planning work. So why don't I repeat the question that will start the conversation, which is this. How can we talk about, or what is the importance of teaching the biographies of the people whose designs and ideas we highlight within our programs? How is this essential to understanding our fields? And how should we include this in our teaching? Can I just go down the line?
Sure, yeah. Okay, great. So I guess I primarily teach in a studio context, so I've been thinking about these questions that I think you brought up, somebody else brought up on this panel about studio culture and the culture in general in architecture that I think still relies on a sort of mentor apprenticeship model. And so maybe to kind of segue a little bit away from your question of saying how do we teach biographies of people while considering the sort of roles. I think a related question I've been thinking about is how do we maybe go away from promoting models of ourselves in studio culture where we tend to promote and pick students who are similar to us in gender or in class or in politics or in sort of educational backgrounds, and those are the students that we are promoting to positions of power or and sort of the cycle continues in that way. So I guess I'm interested in maybe, I don't know if I have an opinion, but maybe opening up a question about how sort of we set up a kind of studio syllabus in that way. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that relates in terms of not only who we're teaching, but how we're teaching, and that's the biography question, right? And that came out of our discussion around the SAMS list and how do you teach those people who, and I think part of it is understanding the culture and context and the individual. But then there's also like the continuing to reinforce that sort of idea of genius and that idea of like the star and the idea of the individual. And I think that perpetuates itself in the sort of studio culture and that mentee-mentor relationship. And start, I'm really interested in the work on collaboration and not just teaching the individual, but teaching who they worked with, When you talk about Le Corbusier, like he worked with his cousin, he had other people in the office like Charlotte Perriand who played a very important role in the design that came out of that office. And given that, like the reality is we are a collaborative practice. When you go out into the profession, most offices do not have some star name at the top. And you have to be able to collaborate with the other people that you're working with. You have to collaborate with the other fields that you're working with. And so how do you, so as a historian and someone who teaches history, like how do you bring that model into teaching? And for me, I think, a big project that I see in my future is writing a new textbook. Because if you go through the textbooks kind of, continue to perpetuate that model of the genius. So.
Actually, can I ask you to follow up on that just a little bit? If you're writing a textbook, how would you privilege collaboration?
I don't know yet.
No, but I think collaboration. I think collaboration is a key point that we should touch on throughout this conversation. Especially, I feel like a couple of you brought up points in our shared Google Doc that collaboration is something that's in practice but not teaching. And you talked about that a little bit just now. But one of you asked if we could actually separate talking about teaching from practice specifically because of that. And I think that's so interesting and a problem if that's the case, if we're not teaching collaboration. Yeah.
One thing that happened in the 60s when, there was that huge rebellion in, the student protests on a variety of issues, but in the architecture schools, there was an objection to sort of the hierarchical culture of the studio and the precisely that kind of model. And schools started to promote collaborative teaching and so even just having like two people leading the studio instead of a single person leading the studio, it's one step. But.
Thank you. I just echoing Abby want to again just extend a huge thanks to the student organizers. There's incredible effort, right, that's gone into, and I know how much effort because one of the organizers missed my class last afternoon, but she had a very good excuse. But really, it's just a phenomenal effort. So, and I just wanted to again acknowledge that before we start. Yes. So I'll talk about planning, which perhaps is slightly different, just given the histories and theories of planning and the kinds of debates around planning pedagogy. This probably goes back a little earlier, but even if you just had to take the 1960s, right? Community control here in the United States, the civil rights movement here in the United States, from the 1940s to the 1960s, various anti-colonial nationalist struggles in the Third World, what we now call the Global South. And all of these have, thankfully, due to struggles, right, it just hasn't made its way into the planning pedagogy, but thanks to struggles have now become a part of the histories and theories of planning. So within the planning canon, we have Dolores Hayden, Susan Feinstein, Leonie Sandercock, June Manning Thomas. I mean, thankfully, it's a growing list, right? It's a list that's growing longer. But there are two things that I'd just like to foreground in this conversation on pedagogy, right? The first is, for instance, if you look at Chicano studies, it's Chicano scholars, right? You look at gender, women, sexuality studies, like it's fueled by the intellectual labor of women and non-heterosexual individuals. So the first question that I'd like to raise is, why is the labor imposed on individuals from the very groups who were sidelined and marginalized in the first place, right? And the one course, I mean, and there are many, many courses which have tried to bring voices from the margins into the mainstream. And one is my friend and colleague Sonia Dumpelman's course, right? The survey course that Sonia teaches, which is a core class, the history of landscape architecture. And in conversations that I've had with Sonia, she talks about how it initially started with a section on women and landscape design. And now it's mainstreamed, right? Women are an integral part of the curriculum. But the question is, this has to be a fairer distribution of labor, right? Revising our pedagogy, and the labor cannot be imposed on certain specific groups. And related to this is the question of power, right? Like, we have to place power centrally in this discussion, because very often institutions do not recognize the kind of scholarship that's trying to bring voices from the margins into the mainstream. So there has to be a change in institutional culture, right? And all of us work in universities. Sometimes universities reward individuals who do this type of scholarship. Very often they do not, right? So we do have to think about also the institutional culture and power in the types of scholarship that we're producing.
I want to also thank the organizers and the students for pulling this together. I was, when I walked in, I was just in awe of seeing so many people, so many students here converging on the topic of what do we do now? How do we make change in academia, in practice? When I think of pedagogy and when I think about biographies, or how do we begin to teach our students, let's say, diversity in terms of voices and thoughts and the ways in which one produces architecture. I have this acronym which I'm constantly projecting on everything that I do, which is called AIM, and the AIM meaning A for assess. So I am constantly assessing the situation. So at RISD, I look at my population, my demographics, and understand where is the group coming from, where is the population coming from. The other one is I, which is includes. How do I amend the information to include that group of people that are absorbing the information? And then lastly is M, which is make structural change, which is literally a reframing of what I thought, let's say, within, what one would consider norm. How do we go against that grain to bring in diversity of thought? So I would say that when I think about autobiographies, I think we should remove ourselves from looking at the architect in terms of an autobiography and instead move forward with three things. One is context, time, and place. So what I mean by that is when you introduce a subject, you have to look at the context. You have to look at the time period, what was going on there politically, economically. And place, meaning, again, what are the social structures that has produced a certain kind of mind thought. And I think that in itself creates an identity to the architect. And when I say architect, it's not just singular, right? So I think that would be like my response to when we think of autobiography, don't think of it in that way. Think time, place, context, to formulate positionality of that work, to see the underlinings of a particular form.
Okay, I think this is on. Yes, thank you. So thank you to all the organizers. I learned at lunch today that there are more than 50. So this is an incredibly impressive venue, occasion, and event. And I would second Abby, incredibly well organized. So thank you. Well, Sai has given me the perfect jumping off point, very kindly bringing to the fore one of the classes that I teach, but I want to actually maybe take that and say two things, because one is that obviously we can do better, I can do better, I need to do better, right? And this is kind of work in progress, and this brings up, I think, what some of you already mentioned, that it's an incredible amount of work, which goes back to the question of biographies. We lack a lot of biographies of the underrepresented groups, but just in general, if we look at the design professions, there are many different reasons for this. In part, it's because we also lack the archives. And so we need more excellent integrated scholarship. We need more design criticism. In order to then be able to build, whether it's a survey class or any kind of other, seminar or lecture class that deals with the built environment, and make that as diverse as possible, or at least assume the many perspectives that we should be assuming. So there's still a lot of groundwork, and I'm especially now, of course, talking for landscape history. There's an incredible amount of groundwork which poses a lot of chances and opportunities, but of course also challenges. So in terms of biographies, I do think that they are incredibly important, and for some reason there has been, they've become out of fashion. I don't really know why. If we look at history, then it's less so, but many of the subdisciplines of history, so meaning the various histories of the designed environment or the built environment, biographies just seem to be out of fashion. And that has been a case for about 20 years, maybe, or at least 10 years. And, here we are actually talking about biography. Here we are talking about identities. And how can you talk about identities if you do not know about the specific biographies of the figures that you're actually talking about? And something that came up, what Hansi suggested, obviously the context that people have lived in, so the social, the political, and cultural contexts are incredibly important to know about in order to be able to understand a designed work properly. So, so these are I think, some talking points here, and maybe to the question of collaboration that also came up. I think it's one of the goals as a teacher is always to try, and at least the way I see it, is always to try and empower the student and to provide the student with the means and methods to learn for themselves. And so in that process, while, at the beginning there might still be kind of more of a model function that the instructor has to play, which is an incredible responsibility and a very daunting responsibility at times also. Basically, in this process, me, at least as a teacher, I always hope that students kind of will learn how to learn for themselves, and ultimately you will become a colleague in that process. And all this is to say that kind of basically teaching and learning is a collaborative process.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. So one of the reasons I'm writing my dissertation is because I feel like we have to keep relearning the history, right? So when you talk about like the lack of biographies, and yes, there is so much more work to be done on that, but here we have the pioneering women in architecture project up on the wall. A lot of those are women that Susanna Torre and the organizers of the 1977 exhibition Women in American Architecture, wrote about 40 years ago. And so the fact that we keep forgetting these histories, and yes, there's so much more work, and I'm working with Laurie Brown and Karen Burns on a global encyclopedia of women in architecture, and that will bring, an international perspective, a global perspective, but also, we're trying to make sure there's more biographies of women in color who've been also very much left out of the histories. But we have to find a way that we don't have to come along every generation and relearn this stuff and start from scratch. Like the project you've done with your students is an amazing project, and you've added a lot of names that I wasn't familiar with. But we shouldn't be, we should be able to build, rather than having to keep going back and keep having to tell our students who Julia Morgan is or who Louise Bethune is, so I just wanted to say that.
Well, in the interest of doing this, can I ask you to talk more about the Women's School of Planning and Architecture in the 70s and sort of talk a little bit about what their intervention and agenda was and why it only lasted for less than a decade?
Yeah. So, I think, I was thinking about that in terms of your next question about
I was using it as
feminist pedagogy. So the Women's School of Planning and Architecture was an experimental school founded in 1974. The first session was in 1975, and they were summer programs. They held 4 of them at different places around the country, and they were really trying to dismantle the hierarchy of the architecture education, create a space for women. There were so few women. There was something like 2,000 women architects in the United States in 1970. So they were very isolated. And, they did co-teaching, but they also, tried to break down the hierarchy between the quote unquote teachers and the students. They had woodworking courses or, local town planning courses where they met with people who were involved in the neighborhood, and did design exercises on the beach with found materials, or one of the workshops was on women's fantasy environments, which was kind of consciousness raising by design. So, and that's very much of that moment. But it was this very experimental. They were outside of any of the schools, and so it allowed them a certain freedom, but it also allowed them the freedom to fail, which ultimately the school did as the context changed. yeah, so, as a historical model, and I think for me that raises the question of like how much can we do within the institutions that we work in, and and do we need to like go outside sometimes and do these more experimental things that don't necessarily get credit or are directly related to the pedagogies that we have to teach with all the requirements, the NFARPs and stuff.
That's an excellent segue to my second question, which is, what defines an alternative or feminist pedagogy? How can feminist activism, such as this event today, lead to a more general critique of inequitable power relations embedded within the norms of our field? But also, let me add to that if you're talking about that it's important that we think about spaces to do this outside of our everyday lives, that's, again, a problem that reaches to Sai's point about the general work of social reproduction that falls on women and minorities in fields that don't accept them as central voices. And while, yes, we should think about the spaces that give us freedom to do that, we should also think about the burdens that we're taking on ourselves and why we have to do that, and to keep that highlighted as a problem. But let's turn to more specific conversations about alternative pedagogy. So I guess, did it work to go down the line again?
Yeah, no, I mean, sure, maybe picking up a little bit on some of the points that were made earlier on collaboration and working outside of the studio context. I think when I think about alternative feminist pedagogies, I think I'm less interested in thinking about a sort of feminist mode of teaching as a category or in and of itself, and more in terms of sort of strategy that starts to move away from looking at architecture as something that's produced by single authors, which is something many people brought up already, as a heroic endeavor that involves just a kind of top-down process of design, construction, building in the world, and thinking more about all the kind of multiple actors, both kind of human and also non-human, that are involved in how we think about the built environment. So for instance, I think I'm interested in how feminist thinking could influence the way that we think about really established ideas in design teaching. Like, I do a lot of work thinking about building afterlives, or how we think about preservation practices in architecture, which I think inevitably is based on very kind of modernist Western value systems, and how thinking about kind of feminist practices within that category, there are a lot of worker, women-owned organizations within the secondhand material industry, building material industry, that actually are influenced by a lot of feminist rhetorics of radical care and maintenance, and that kind of, I feel like, puts a very different understanding on a concept that we're all really used to thinking about in a sort of different way within the academy.
To Abby's point of, it's also a question of where teaching happens, right? So even if we had to just look within the university, I'm reminded of this one thesis. It was in the aftermath of that, the whole debate on the North Carolina bathroom bill, right? And there was a student who was looking at, this is really about right to the city, right? The transgenders' right to the city. If you don't have a place to pee, like, how are you going to teach, how are you going to study, how are you going to work, how are you going to travel in public transit, right? So it's fundamentally a question about the right to the city and right to space. And the thesis was in the toilet, which was very helpful for all of us as well, right? Because you really, we all talk about the production of space, right? But it really just grounded spatial politics in a very, very real way. But if we had to expand from that for the planning discipline and the planning profession, just thinking about the politics in the design and planning of toilets, right? It's so important because firstly, it foregrounds like this old but extremely important feminist slogan of the personal is political, right? And secondly, it just highlights like the specific gender identity around which much of our design and planning of the built environment is focused, right? So I remember when I was a master's student at MIT, this was 2006 to 2008, and this probably changed because Abby was there later. The toilets, the women's toilets were only on alternate floors. Right? And I wonder if that had to do with the fact that women weren't admitted to MIT till later, and then of course you couldn't demolish the building and then you just have the toilet on every alternate floor, right? But really thinking about the design and planning of something as mundane as toilets just foregrounds like the political economy of gender politics, right? And the power around allocation of resources and gender.
Thanks. When I think of feminist pedagogy, I'm thinking of the course I just did at RISD in the spring, this past spring. It was, I received a grant from SEI, is Social Equity Inclusion, and the grant was for, well, the proposal was for me to teach a seminar course on women architects, but specifically looking at women of color and queer. And so I think that academia has to really throw away this idea of inclusion or working within the status quo, within the patriarchal, normal hegemony. I literally just put it out there, and the reason why there was a call from the college was because students were protesting that they were not being heard, that their culture didn't matter, that their ethnicity, their gender, their sexuality was not being put forth. And so I'm an architect, I'm not a historian, and a lot of my interest has been to really understand a history, understand my identity. And if I have those questions, I'm assuming that everyone has those questions. And so by just starting from the present and working collaboratively with the student as a research platform, one can acquire an enormous amount of knowledge. And I think that's, so it's hard for me to accept this idea of, I would say that we are in this position because a lot of history has purposely been erased. We have to look at architecture history within colonialism. And so I think we have to really redo how we acquire knowledge in education. How do we, this platform is great because I think in terms of making change, we can begin to create networks and collection and begin to not let it be a generational constant struggle of same issues being put forth. So the answer, I think the answer is to centralize the non-canon, and begin with all your resources being women, queer women, women of color. Let's start from there. And then we can have a conversation about where does this go, right? And how does it begin to then transform the powers at play in the construction field? So women contractors, I believe there's 18% of women in terms of labor force are in construction, but 80% of them have experienced sexual harassment in the workforce. Why aren't we talking about the design and the construction industry, and then potentially that creates a much more larger kind of cultural movement and shifts in our world. So we can move forward and stop trying to be included in something when it was never, when Black women couldn't even practice in the U.S. for a long time. So this, I love this timeline. I would like this timeline. And then just to let you guys know, there's a website called womenarchitecture.com, and that was really produced by the students at RISD in my seminar, and us trying to just put knowledge out there to be shared with the world, to stop the perpetrating, to stop the continuation of systematic exclusion of women of color and queer. Sorry,
So feminist pedagogies. So I'm wondering, so as we're sitting here, I'm seeing a lot of females, and we're talking a lot about women specifically. So I'm, first of all, I guess one of the points that I want to make is that basically this, for me at least, is only a stand-in for other underrepresented groups, or even more underrepresented groups. And so basically this is a way to look at things. It's a certain perspective that you can assume, but it's only one of very many perspectives. And secondly, the question that I've had in terms of my own teaching, whereas I've always had the aspiration to, let's include as many perspectives as you can, obviously. So that's the goal, that's the objective. And yet, and that's why I said I'm seeing so many kind of women in this audience. We're talking among each other, and we need to be talking to other genders, right? Not only the female gender. And so this, brings me to this question whether or not, and I'm curious to hear kind of from everybody really, what you think. Is this enough? Like, is it enough to mainstream or normalize, let's say, the inclusion of whether it's females or, any other kind of group that we have not looked at in detail yet? Or do we need specific classes to address this? So up until now, I've heard a lot about these specific classes, right? Whereas kind of my own goal has always been to basically mainstream this, and maybe write this textbook of whatever kind that actually kind of revises histories and so forth. But it seems that is not enough. So that's kind of basically my conclusion of the last couple of years. It seems that is actually not enough, right? That we need to do both, maybe. But I would like to hear other voices on this.
Yeah, I agree we have to do both. Absolutely. I don't think there's one, I mean, the issues are so complex. There's not just one approach that you can take. We need to continue discovering the biographies, but we also need to mainstream it because, there's still those if you look at the effectiveness of the NCARB requirements to bring in non-Western examples, and that's become something that history teachers have to teach and, has to be a certain percentage. And there's still so much work to be done on that, but it's happening. Why can't there be an NCARB requirement that we teach about women and architects of color that are underrepresented as well? But at the same time, we also need to kind of totally smash up the system and go do our own thing for a while and different, so I think you need both.
I think, Sai, I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh, last word?
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, no.
No, but I think that's a fantastic point, Sonia. I mean, it's something that I've been struggling with as well, not just in terms of gender, but also the work that I do, which is theorizing from the global south, right? And what does that mean? And so if I could just use an analogy from that, and perhaps we can then think about what that means in terms of gender. So I was at a planning conference last week, and it was about, there was a round table theorizing from the global south, and there were 6 of us women of color, right, on that panel. And the chair of my department, Diane Davis, was in the audience, and she came up to me at the end of it, and she said, you know, that was a very interesting panel, it was necessary. And she was like, but it was very interesting that all of y'all are women of color, right? And most of you grew up in non-Western countries. So again, I go back to this question of the labor, right? The intellectual and emotional labor that goes into revising the pedagogy. And one of the things that we were brainstorming is perhaps have a course where it's counterpoints, right? The global north and the global south co-taught together. Right, so that may be one way where like we don't want this becoming like some kind of a ghetto within the academy, right?
That was an excellent point to wrap up on. I want to open the discussion to the audience, and let me just ask, if you have questions, please wait for a microphone to come to you, because this is being recorded, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Leib. I am a Master in Landscape Architecture student, as well as a Master in Design in the History and Philosophy of Design. Building on the points that were just made, I wanted to ask more explicitly about the disciplines that have departments in design schools, and how you see, to what extent you see working between disciplines as a vital part of changing the status quo. So a course that integrates the global north and the global south is a great idea, and I was wondering if you could maybe brainstorm more out loud about whether working across departments is possible, or whether you need more support or voices coming from students to enable you as professors to make these changes and to develop these courses. A lot of, so please speak more about that, because it can help us as students help you.
Are we collecting or no? Yes, an enthusiastic embrace of this idea. I think we need more resources, we need more support. Mostly this means we need more time. And so that means, like, what are we doing? So it's a question of labor. It's not a question of will at all. It's not a question of motivation. I think we're super motivated. We're extremely happy that we're here and being able to talk with you. So that's the way I see it. There are 24 hours a day.
Hi, my name is Sydney, and I'm a first-year planning student here. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your insight. My question is about what do you all see as the role of recognizing different kinds of expertise in the classroom as a part of what you're talking about, of the goals around decolonizing pedagogy and the classroom.
Well, I think maybe it's not just about recognizing different kinds of expertise, but also encouraging different models of how we measure success. I think the way that we model the success of a student in a classroom right now is based on a very kind of male model of speaking up, of having a really kind of linear narrative in your design project, or even things that we consider as really automatic responses now are things that are based on a very specific kind of person. And so I think it's maybe this isn't exactly answering what your question is posing, but I think it's less about this question of expertise and more about just saying, well, how do we acknowledge different ways of kind of practicing architecture that we see as successful?
Really brings to the fore the kinds of biases that we're working with, right? Because I was just thinking about this. There was a studio it was based in India, and there was a student who was redesigning some apartments in India. And it was based on like a 1-week trip to India, and the student had very overzealously redesigned the units of the apartment. And during the review, and I was one of the reviewers, he said, and one of my main interventions, and I hate this word interventions, it's so masculine. Like whatever, design actions, planning actions. And he said, one of my main interventions is to bring down this wall so that when the Indian woman is cooking, she can talk to her family. And I was like, my goodness, like to just erase like the histories of South Asian feminisms. But like the studio is very helpful in that way, right? Because space, the way in which we're producing space and the way in which designers produce space through a studio project really brings to the fore like all of these biases that we have, right? And of course, this turned into a very good learning moment because the instructor, the reviewers, all of us had a very important conversation on South Asian feminisms, right?
Hello, my name is Namrata. I'm from Mumbai, India, but I'm a RISD undergrad currently, so hello, Hansi. I actually this morning I was in a workshop called Masculinities, and we learned the concept of taking space versus making space. So I was wondering how you would encourage the idea of making space in a studio, especially for students. Just because, a lot of taking up and making of space is like, a lot of it you learn at home or from your culture, but a part of it is also from the education system. So I was wondering how you would encourage students to be more encouraging towards other students and like help everyone, express their opinions and that's about it.
Well, maybe I can ask Sai to continue to talk about that studio example, and ask you, if you hadn't been there, do you think that conversation would have happened? And what were the responses of students that were listening to the conversation? Do you feel like, I guess, how much of it is our job to show that it's okay to challenge? And how do we do that in a way that also shows that it's okay that you don't have to have, that it's okay to say this makes me feel uncomfortable. You don't necessarily have to have a fully formed argument.
And I do think the reason why it was such a good learning moment in that studio was 2 reasons, right? One, because the instructor of the studio is someone who's deeply steeped in design politics in India. And I think that's very important, right, for instructors. Like when we're going off and working, particularly in the global south, we're going with so many going to Sydney's point on decolonization, we're going with so many wrong assumptions, right, on how these societies work. So one is it was very helpful because the instructor was deeply steeped in the design politics of the place, and he created an opening for the conversation. And secondly was a composition of reviewers. Right, there were many women reviewers, and so it was just helpful. And this is not to say that men can't be feminists, right? My father is a feminist, but really the composition of reviewers was equally important in enabling or fostering that conversation. so I do think it's important when we're working in contexts that are unfamiliar to us, that the instructor just knows the context and the reviews, right? And this is something that keeps coming up. There's the Dean Diversity Initiative. Like, really, we need to diversify the reviewers who are coming and engaging with students in studio.
I feel like I need to respond to the question regarding take and make space. I think is really interesting, and try to link it to the experience that you had in your crit room. I would say that what a wonderful concept of teaching our students to take space rather than make space. And I would say that what I found it to be really an eye-opener was in our seminar when we started surveying the actual courses that they were currently taking of all their core. History, architecture representation, looking at precedents. It was, without looking at the faculty that was teaching, it was mind-blowing to see that still 95% were the male canons, which is like still shocking to me. And what I found interesting is I was trying to tell my students, well, speak up, help the faculty, here are some other resources. And I realized that our students are very vulnerable of taking space. But what I found interesting is how powerful the collective as a community can be to making certain changes. So when the class and myself put it together as showing the results of the survey coming from the seminar course, it really made huge impacts. And so in terms of, it comes down to not only take space, but a safe space. So I would say, yes, let's teach our students, make, but create a safe space for opportunities to emerge of making difference. So I did have a Chinese student that when we created the seminar, we stated this is a safe space. There's nothing wrong that you can say. And we realized culturally, the student has also been removed from certain information. And so, I provided Lin Hunyuan, a Chinese woman architect, for him to study and looking at it in terms of when Imperial China. And it was informative for that student in terms of the learning process. And so I think that it's very natural, I've done it before, to say, why are you sexualizing that woman in your Photoshop? I still do it as a shock value, but we generally forget that men, they need a safe space too of making error, and for us not to penalize some of the ignorance that has been learned, potentially, right, at home or culture or our political environment. So I just wanted to link the idea of make, take, and safe, for us not to be judgmental in that, to evolve, right, our discipline.
Yeah, and I think recognizing how much power you have as students, where I'm seeing changes happening in schools, it's places like this where student groups are getting together and saying, why is this not being taught? Why are we not having these conversations, and forcing the faculty and forcing the schools to change. So, keep that in mind, work together and yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Great.
Hi, my name is Connie Trin, and I'm a landscape architecture student. So kind of going off of what you're saying, and understanding that you work in these institutions with competing pedagogies, I want to ask, do you feel heard by your institutions, and kind of put you on the spot, in critique of the institutions that you're a part of, or in praise? How can you be more supported, and what are your demands?
I guess I feel like maybe a lot of the conversations we've been having today has been around how we as educators think within the context of our classes and our teaching. And I wish, and this isn't a shortcoming on the part of my institution, I feel like it's a question I haven't raised yet, but I feel like there needs to be more responsibility on our part to kind of think about the front end of why there isn't more diversity within architecture schools or on architecture panels, and it has to do with the fact that there are these entry barriers into our profession. It's an extremely expensive degree, it's a long degree. I think the way that we have to kind of rethink the way that we advertise courses, that we recruit students, that we even write job postings for faculty positions, because all of those encourage a certain model of a person who is able to take on this kind of discipline. So I wish maybe that there was more conversation on the front end of this issue.
Sonia, you look.
Yeah, so the students of this school put on a fantastic initiative, or since the SMA or SAM, I always kind of mix up the SAM, right? List, collected basically words like transparency. Or describing observations they had made in the school, and I think all those observations were on point. And so, anything that you can do, that we can do. I mean, I think we need to try harder, probably, but it's incredibly difficult in the system that we're in. So that's maybe a point to make here. So I think this is basically a thank you to bringing up certain problems that we have at this school, and hopefully an encouragement to not forget and continue this initiative.
The problem of this school, believe me, it's in every school. And I wanted to say thank you. Actually, various schools are listening to the Women in Design group at Harvard. So you guys have set a really great model. Students were aware of Beatrice Colomina that you brought last year, or in this past spring. In terms of institution, I would say, it depends on the structure of each college, of each architecture program. I would say that the biggest game changer that could occur is held in the department chair role, or whether the school has just the dean position, not a department chair. I know that our department chair creates the course table. So whoever is in charge of creating course table has to really think about the material that's being put out for the students. Power, in terms of what I'm experienced, to me, that's the most powerful position of changing pedagogy for school.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. But let me end by saying that in terms of institutional support, I feel an incredible amount of support from my students, from all of you. And so regardless of the bigger institutional fights we have ahead of us, let me just say thank you to all of you.